Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Thomas Jefferson, and the focus is the leader of the opposition. The year is 1794, and Jefferson has just retired from George Washington's cabinet as Secretary of State. He is more than happy to retreat back to his mountaintop home in Northern Virginia called Monticello, his family, his farm. This is where he wants to be, and the last thing he wants to do is think about politics. But politics won't let him rest, because in the last couple of years of the Washington administration, there are continuing acts that Jefferson has a big problem with. And one of them revolves around this action called the Whiskey Rebellion. There were farmers in western Pennsylvania who were balking at a new tax that came as part of Alexander Hamilton, the Treasury Secretary's new economic plan for the country, which would place a tax on whiskey. Well, that meant a tax on the wheat farmers in western Pennsylvania and other parts of the country, because that's where a lot of their wheat ended up as whiskey. They didn't like it. They felt they were being oppressed. They decided to rebel. And there were different perspectives on this across the country. Most were horrified by this. They wanted the law enforced, and this is what George Washington was adamant about. If you don't like the law, change the law. We have a law, we're going to enforce the law. And he raises a militia that's going to crush this rebellion before it gets too far. And in fact, they see the army coming, and the rebels eventually sort of dissipate and the whole thing goes away. Jefferson is of a complete different mind of this, and he thinks this is tyranny on display. Jefferson, as he wrote previously, he likes a little rebellion now and then. It helps keep the people in power honest, and he felt there was nothing wrong with this uprising and everything wrong with this heavy-handed approach of the government using its military to try to quash, which were just free citizens looking to pursue their own best interests. So Jefferson is continuing to be very concerned about the direction of his government. And then it goes even further in his mind with a treaty that the Washington administration negotiates with Great Britain. Now, the United States is having challenges with both France and Britain, who are at war with each other. And frankly, all George Washington wants is to not get into war with either of them. He has this proclamation of neutrality in place. But he realizes that there were problems on the high seas, in particular Britain impressing American sailors into the British Navy, but also French ships that were attacking American commercial vessels because they were saying they were potentially heading off to Britain. Hundreds of these ships were being impacted by this challenge. So Washington sends the Chief Justice, John Jay, to Britain to try to negotiate a deal. And he does. And the deal is not perfect. In fact, a lot of people think it's far from perfect. But Washington signs onto it, and it passes the Senate by one vote because it deflects war. There's not going to be war with Britain thanks to the Jay Treaty. There was also some economic agreements that Washington kind of liked. It did not stop impressment. It did not return runaway slaves that had run away during the Revolution, which is what the South really wanted from Britain. So a lot of people are upset, including Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson believes this is another example of a sellout by the monocrats and the Anglo-men who are always favoring Britain, never favoring France, which is much more of his alliance and his allegiance. And so he continues to be upset with the direction of his government. Now, political parties did not exist at the beginning of the country, but they come along soon thereafter. They were thought of in a negative light, but they eventually were recognized to become virtually a necessity. Jefferson had his own evolution on this topic. In 1789, when he first came back to the United States and France, he commented that I never submitted the whole system of my opinion to the creed of any party of men whatever in religion, in philosophy, in politics, or in anything where I was capable of thinking for myself. Such an addiction is the last degradation of a free and moral agent. If I could not go to heaven but with a party, I would not go there at all. Well, then Jefferson evolves. A couple of years later, after the Washington administration passes the bill to stand up the Bank of the United States, Jefferson is disappointed, and he and James Madison go on a little vacation. They head up to New York, and they're having a lovely time seeing the outdoors, a new part of the country he's never seen. But they're also taking meetings. And they're having meetings with leaders in New York and other parts of New England who tend to lean to the anti-federalist perspective, potentially drawing alliances that could be called upon later for more of a national stand against the entrenched Federalists. This is the beginning of the Democratic-Republican Party. Jefferson now in 1794 has come full circle. He's now out of the government, and he makes the statement, but where the principle of difference is as substantial and as strongly pronounced as between the Republicans and the monocrats of our country, I hold it as honorable to take a firm and decided part and as immoral to pursue a middle line. Jefferson basically is taking that role as the leader of the opposition. Now, he takes that one step further. Jefferson always respected George Washington. He disagreed with him on many things, but he was respectful. But then he writes a letter, and Jefferson was known to do this, to write letters that eventually get published that come back to haunt him. And this was one of those letters. It goes to a gentleman by the name of Philip Mazzei in Italy. I've been in the United States previously and gotten to know Jefferson and others in the government. And Jefferson writes, "The aspect of our politics has wonderfully changed since you left us. In place of that noble love of liberty and republican government which carried us through the war, an Anglican, monarchical, and aristocratical party has sprung up, whose avowed object is to draw over us the substance, as they have already done the forms, of the British government. It would give you a fever were I to name to you the apostates who have gone over to these heresies, men who were Samsons in the field and Solomons in the council, but who have had their heads shorn by the harlot England." Basically, he was pointing at at President George Washington. As General Washington, he was, again, the Samson in the field, but no longer. He is signed on with Britain. He's a monocrat. And this then letter becomes public. The break with Washington is complete, and they go their separate ways. Well, Washington also goes his separate way in 1796 by way of the electoral process. The first contested presidential election in American history occurs in that year. Washington had been the unanimous choice in the first two presidencies, but now he has decided he is going to retire. And so let's figure out who's going to be the candidates and who's going to be elected as president of the United States. Well, there were no nominating conventions. There were no primaries at the time. At best, you had a congressional caucus that sort of put forward candidates. And in this case, it was not a surprise that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were the two that were put forward. Adams is more aligned to the thinking of the Federalists, and obviously Jefferson, a leader of the Democratic Republicans, the Anti-Federalists. The election is close. It comes down to a 3-vote margin. Adams wins, 71 to 68. Most of the North goes for Adams. Most of the South goes for Jefferson. At the time, Jefferson, as the second vote getter, becomes the vice president. It's the only time in American history where the leader of the opposition is the vice president of the United States. This would be corrected with the 12th Amendment after this time it occurs. But for now, Adams is president, Jefferson is the vice president. What would their relationship be? These two, incredibly close when they were overseas. Now they've become more distant and politically separate. Could a rapprochement occur? Could they work together? Well, both thought it possible, and they both were going to reach out and maybe see if they could work together. But frankly, their friends and allies think it's a terrible idea. It never comes together, and Jefferson is not included at all in the executive branch, which again was not unusual in these early goings, where the vice president really did just the constitutional responsibility as president of the Senate. And that's what Thomas Jefferson did for the next 4 years. In the Senate, it was dominated by Federalists. There weren't many tie votes, so Jefferson really didn't have a lot to do, so he decided to write. He wrote something called Jefferson's Manual, and it was a set of parliamentary procedures on how the Senate should function. Pretty good job for a presiding officer in his role to come up with a bunch of rules. Well, it was so good that pretty soon the House of Representatives adopted it, and the country has used it pretty much ever since. There have been tweaks on it, but you can see a lot of the parliamentary procedure used in Congress today dates back to Jefferson's Manual. The primary issue during the Adams administration was whether or not to go to war with France, and we covered that a lot in a previous episode on John Adams. But a key element of this, which touches upon Jefferson, is while there was this discussion of war and patriotic fervor in favor of sort of the government and the president, there was also concern about sedition, people coming out against the government. And Congress passes a couple of laws which are completely odious to Jefferson: the Alien Act and the Sedition Act. The Alien Act said the president, without any judicial review, could evict any foreigner from the country if he felt him to be dangerous to the country. The Sedition Act was about the written and spoken word. If you write or speak out against Congress or the president, you can be arrested and you can be jailed. Jefferson was completely opposed to these, saw them as violations of basic rights, let alone the rights in the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights. He had to figure out what to do. And he's the vice president of the United States, but he's not inclined to simply sit still. There was nothing in the Constitution, in the original Constitution, that said how laws would be evaluated for whether or not they are constitutional. Right now, we know that that is a job of the Supreme Court, but the topic of judicial review doesn't come along actually for several more years until the court under John Marshall effectively gives it itself that power. At the time, there really was nothing in place to say that federal law is unconstitutional and what to do about it, at least no legal way of doing that. Well, Jefferson decides to pursue one. He believes that if there is an unconstitutional law that is passed, as members of a compact, the individual states have full authority to declare that law unconstitutional, at least within its own borders. And he pursues the topic of nullification. And he has a colleague in the Kentucky legislature put forward a resolution that in part said that whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. As in all other cases of compact among powers having no common judge, each party has an equal right to judge for itself, as well of infractions as of the mode and measure of redress. As far as Jefferson was concerned, any state could declare a federal law unconstitutional. This is what was called nullification. Now, he got it through in Kentucky, and Jefferson felt, well, if some other states will sign on, we could really get somewhere with this. So he has James Madison introduce a very similar piece of legislation in the Virginia Assembly called the Virginia Resolution. But he actually pushes Madison to go a little further. And we get an inkling as to how strongly Jefferson felt about this, because he said in a letter to Jefferson in proposing this resolution, determined were we to be disappointed in this, to sever ourselves from that union we do much value, rather than give up the rights of self-government which we have reserved and in which alone we see liberty, safety, and happiness. To sever ourselves, he was talking potential secession if these wrongs could not be righted. Now, this was too much for Madison even. He did not put this in his proposal in his Virginia resolution, but it does go to the mindset of Thomas Jefferson. Now, for the country, fortunately, no other states sign on, so there is no nullification. But in truth, if you want to hand out titles, the father of something, if Thomas Jefferson was the father of something, he was the father of nullification. This topic comes up many, many times in the future, really up until the Civil War when the issue is fully put to bed. And other leaders would often point to Jefferson's Kentucky resolution as the justification for trying to nullify a federal law. Well, Adams eventually decides not to go to war with France. That decision actually costs him. The Federalist Party fractures. His re-election opportunity is pretty much gone by the wayside, and all of a sudden, you have Thomas Jefferson waiting in the wings. Jefferson and Adams were going to run against each other in 1800. Jefferson running along with Aaron Burr. The way the rules were at the time, both of them get the same number of votes, Jefferson and Burr. That means it goes to the House of Representatives, takes 36 ballots, but Jefferson is then elected formally as the third president of the United States. The leader of the opposition is now the man in charge. That's the story for another day. That is Thomas Jefferson and leader of the opposition from the life of Thomas Jefferson. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.